Hello my fellow YouTube followers and welcome to a brand new video on this YouTube channel. I'm your narrator Mr. Reddit, and let's get into it. Surgeons of Reddit, what was your oh shit moment? Doing a C-section for this poor mum who'd been in labor for hours. Baby wouldn't come out of the hole we'd made, so more pressure was applied to the fundus, top of the uterus, and suddenly whoosh, baby zooms out like a torpedo, covered in lubricating vernix, zips over the surgical sheeting which has the texture of a slip and slide and almost rockets straight off the table. The baby's foot was caught by the reg who whipped her up in the air upside down like in old cartoons, but almost dropped her again due to gloves plus vernix. Thankfully the midwife was ready with a towel and caught the baby to wrap her up. Mum and dad seemed to think this was normal practice and didn't notice, but me and my colleague just stared at each other with a look of absolute horror. It still makes me shudder to think how close the baby was to hitting the floor head first. Never happened before or since. Doctors were very accommodating and even had a baby juggling routine to put new mothers at ease. 5 stars, would give birth again. When I was a new RN working the ICU in a large teaching hospital, I came into work one morning to a patient that was admitted that night, intubated, breathing tube in, sedated, Farley catheter, tube and PP hole, and all. Long story short, he was extubated, breathing tube out, that same shift, and was completely alert and oriented. He was an end-stage renal patient, meaning his kidneys didn't work and he needed dialysis, and was only in his late 30s. Said he never made urine anymore and didn't need the Farley catheter, so he wanted it out because it was hurting. Now the catheter bag had been empty my whole shift, which is normal seeing as how he didn't make urine anymore, and this hospital had a nurse-driven Farley removal policy, meaning while we needed a doctor's order to insert one, we could remove one at our discretion, unless a doctor specifically put in orders not to. This patient had no such doctor order, so I went to remove the catheter. They are held in the bladder by a balloon on the end that is inflated with 10 milliliters of saline. I de-inflated the balloon, removing 10 milliliters of saline, and pulled it out. As soon as the catheter left his PP, blood started pouring out in a heavy stream. Turns out the nurse who placed it on admission hadn't advanced it far enough, since there was no urine production to indicate correct placement, and had inflated the balloon while still in his urethra, causing trauma. It would not stop bleeding. I had to hold this man's PP shut to put pressure on it, while my coworker paged the resident who came and looked at me with pity as he told me to just keep holding this 30-something-year-old man's PP in my hands to staunch the blood flow until urology could get there to assess. It just kept gushing blood every time I eased up to check. For over an hour total I held this man's PP and tried to make polite conversation until the urologist arrived. Not a surgeon, but was working in obstetric theatre in UK mid-heatwave last year. This is important as maternity wards are kept quite warm as newborn babies aren't good at regulating their temperatures. Combine this with a heatwave and the fact that in Britain we are not exactly used to high temperatures and we have the perfect storm. Mid-emergency Cassery and the scrub nurse assisting the op starts feeling faint. This is unusual as this scrub nurse worked in these theaters full time, so this was her bread and butter, so I can only conclude it was the heat. She has to step out, so the senior house office takes her place assisting the obs registrar with the section. This senior house office looked extremely junior, as in first section ever, and they were trying to assist with the instruments in the uterus when they fainted. I had to jump in and grab the back of their theater gown to stop them faceplanting the open uterus, and then sort of gently tug backwards to let them fall into me when someone else has taken over assisting. This senior house officer was not exactly small. Thank God the baby was already out. Had an oh shit moment as a patient on the operating table. A couple of years ago I was in labor for 28 hours, pushing for 6, when my child started showing signs of distress. He had slightly elevated heart rate, and I had the makings of a fever. My midwife at the hospital told me the doctor was coming in to check to see if a vacuum assist could help. She checks me and immediately stands up with blood on her hand and says we are going to the OR now. At that time, I started feeling that zoomed out tunnel vision I know for me is shock. I had anxiety, but figured she knew what was best. She did. We got in the OR 8 minutes later, and when they opened me up, I heard the surgeon say, "Oh shit." Look at this. They say blood in my catheter bag, and upon fully opening me up found my son was actually trying to come through my uterus. He had ruptured it. They got my son out. Those moments where he was stunned and not crying were an eternity. He cried and he was born a completely healthy baby. After I woke up and was back in my room, the doctor came in and told me what happened. I knew a ruptured uterus sounded bad, but oh damn, I googled and started having a massive anxiety attack. A ruptured uterus is extremely rare and so very dangerous and often fatal. I read from the time it happens you have about 15 minutes before you bleed out and baby is dead. When I went back for my post C-section follow-up, my midwife let me know as a practice that's been around 35 years with over 30 midwives and doctors, they had never once encountered that, and it was such a big deal for them. A few days after my birth they all got together to discuss my case. I was so incredibly fortunate I chose to labor in hospital that the doctor just knew from my vitals and babies that something was off. They just didn't know until they got me open. I can't even tell you how grateful I'm for Dr. S. You saved my life and my son's life, and our family would forever be grateful. That's everything for this video. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll be back very soon. See ya.